1993, 3 PSE studies. And I've talked about 2 of those studies, and now I'm going to be working on study 3. This was a really interesting study for me. I had just been to the Deaf Club for about the umpteenth time in which somebody was ridiculing how we sign this word run. And I was thinking, you know, yes, we do sign run differently. That's why it's English. I mean, that's how English works. You know, you have a lot of words and you use them for multiple meanings, and that's English. And so I decided to set up a study around the word run. And so it was called Adults' Ability to Transcribe the Multiple Meanings of Run in Context, given 2 models. And what I did is I had 38 hearing adults, all of whom had 8 or more years of experience signing PSE, and they all considered themselves to be experts. Now, I live in Kansas City. There are 10,000 deaf adults. There's a Gallaudet Regional Center. There's my program. There's the Kansas School for the Deaf. There's an interpreter training program. So there are a lot of hearing people around who are very skilled signers. 40% of the people were CODAs. Okay, and I randomly divided them into 2 groups. So we'll just call that Group A and Group B. And not to get real technical here, but I set up the studies so that the different groups got different stories at different times, and so that was all controlled. So if one story was a little bit easier, then the groups flipped and another group got that first or second. So the order was controlled. And the stories were equal stories. One of the stories was signed in C, and the other story was signed in PSE. So professionals signed each story on videotape. There were no significant differences between the versions of the stories with regard to form and content. And I have one of the stories. I'll just read a little bit to you. These are stories that Jeralee, I think, or maybe Esther wrote. When I left work today, I had no trouble getting to my van started. It runs fine since the tune-up. But then I ran into trouble with the runoffs from yesterday's rain. Would you believe that by the time the other vehicles got through the flooded area, I had run out of gas? Then I was in such a hurry to get to an in-service that I ran a red light and got ticketed. So you can see that there's a lot of different uses of run, but it's within context. The story makes sense. And again, I looked at adults' abilities to transcribe these sentences. And these first 2, oh no, this is it, okay. So there was a trend for subjects to do better on the second story because they saw 2 stories, one in PSE and then one in English, or one in C2 and then one in PSE. It just depended. But they always did better on the second story because the second stories were highly similar. Okay, the subjects were able to transcribe the form of the C2 subjects, the subjects were able to transcribe the form of the C2 stories significantly more accurately than they were able to transcribe the form of the PSE stories. Okay, so even though none of these people knew C2, but they were hearing, they had an English language base, and they did better in the C2 stories than they did in the PSE stories. And again, it would be that same reason, that same type of thing where, you know, you're getting this like time fleeting and you're supposed to write down what it means. And so when they were able to do that in C, they did better. That is, they could retrieve the grammar and the syntax of English more proficiently using English, C2, than PSE. Okay? This is not an unexpected result given that that PSE does not utilize a rich, mature grammar. You know, PSE is like a combination of English and ASL, so it doesn't have a rich, mature grammar, and it doesn't have the syntax of either ASL or English. Okay, the subjects were able to transcribe the meaning of the C2 stories significantly more than they were able to transcribe the meaning of the PSE stories. Okay, Okay, so all in all, in the results of the PSE studies that I did, and I think this is important because PSE is so used in this country that I think it's time that we stand up and say, you know, pick ASL, pick English, but don't pick PSE or contact language or C signed English, any conceptual form. So the summary of these three studies was that PSE is a contact language. It functions as a vehicle of communication, not as a model of English, and it was never designed to be used in the classroom. Deaf children that were studied in that 1988 study who were exposed to PSE did not score as high on tests of reading and English language as did children who were exposed to models of C1 and C2. Adult signers of PSE had difficulty transcribing test sentences that they had produced themselves 2 years earlier and seemed unable to retrieve particular aspects of English form and meaning. Adult signers of PSE had difficulty transcribing themselves or others signing figurative expressions of English. And again, I just want to say that is so important because figurative English is reading. You have, if you're going to read well, you have to be able to tackle figurative English. And finally, adult signers who never studied C, did not use it, and in many cases were politically opposed to it, could transcribe English form and meaning while watching C with more accuracy than they could while watching PSE. And of course, they never let me use them again as subjects. Okay, lastly, I would just like to talk about some current studies that are in this handout and explain why. There's a study, there's a piece by Don Moores on the bottom of page 7 that's called One Hand Clapping, and it's an editorial that he did in the American Annals of the Deaf. Although I think Don rides the cautious fence, he, at least as editor of the American Annals, has been a good friend of ours in not jumping on the ASL bandwagon. And in this, and he's a highly visible deaf educator, so I think that's very important. And in this paragraph where I summarized his work, I just give you some of the important quotes out of there that suggest that the bye-bye approach to education is not going to work. And there's been other things that have come out since then, but I think you have to look at this and the time that it occurred. Also in this editorial, he talks about this school outside of Boston where children were being fined if they used endings to words. And he put a lot of that kind of thing right out there for the public to know about, and that was very important. Also on page 8, that continues on to page 8. Also on page 8 is an article that Peter Paul published in the Volta Review. It actually came out last year, even though it was written earlier, because Volta's a little messed up these days, and they've been a little behind in getting their journal out. And it's called First and Second English Literacy, First and Second Language English Literacy. And this is a book, an article that really summarizes some of the main themes of his book, which is listed in that paragraph as well, called Literacy and Deafness. Literacy and Deafness is a really challenging book to read. However, it's very thorough, and that is the gift that Peter Paul gives to us. He is a deaf man in Ohio who reviews the first and second language research that we have, as well as the literacy research that we have, puts it all together, and then allows people like me to come along and use that to provide more practical applications of that work. And he spoke here last summer for 3 days. All his stuff was videotaped, and John Butler would be a person that you could contact that would have access to those videotapes. And one of the biggest things that Peter Paul has done has been to say, you know, this bye-bye thing is just not going to work either. So I just wanted to mention that I have a copy of that Volta article along. He talks a lot about what has to happen. He calls it the reciprocity. It means like the give and take between conversation and printed forms of language. In other words, he's saying that he has this little diagram in his book that looks like this, and he's saying that there is nothing in the literature to suggest in any language that you could go from conversational ASL to what the secondary form here means is written English. You just can't make that leap. And what you need to do is it's fine to be proficient in ASL, but you also need to have conversational form skills, grammar skills in English to be able to read English. And one of his quotes that I've always been surprised has never been picked up in the literature, I think because he's deaf, quite frankly, is that he says, is ASL sufficient for developing English literacy skills? This question is motivated by approaches that focus on teaching English literacy through American Sign Language and print only, which is what bye-bye is. From this previous discussion of literacy and second language research, which he's previously discussed in his book, the current answer to the question is no. American Sign Language is no more sufficient to developing English literacy skills than is Chinese. Now, believe me, if I had said that, I'd be dead. So I have the cover here of the Literacy and Deafness book that he's written. It came out last summer. It's an excellent, excellent book, but it's a bit tough to get through. Okay, I also have wanted to mention work by the Robart School in Canada, and they wrote an article to the American Annals of the Deaf documenting the progress. This is a residential school in Canada that uses C2, and they've been at it a long time. I was up there with David Stewart when they had been doing it for about 12 years, and so now it's probably been about 15 or 20. I can't remember how long ago that was that we were up there, but they are a residential school, which is an interesting thing, and they have had to really fight the ASL battle and able to keeping their school the way it is. So they wrote an article that was published in the American Annals of the Deaf documenting the SAT HI scores of their students, and included all the students and how many of them had very high levels of English language and reading proficiency skills, and they published that as a letter to the editor in the American Annals of the Deaf. Now, the politics behind that is that probably it wouldn't stand well as an article, so Don Moores probably suggested to them that they write it as a letter to the editor so that it could be there for people like us to read. And that's another one that I neglected to put in your handout. So I'd like to end by just reminding you that I'm looking for good C2 programs. I really think that it's time for us to document the reading and writing and English language abilities of many of our students that we know have done well, because people can't get at that information. I mean, we all kind of know it, and we hear about Plano and Odessa and Austin and some of these schools where good things are happening, but if you went to find achievement scores on those children, you would have a hard time. So what I've done is I have offered to those kinds of programs that I will come and do free in-service work if they'll give me access to their student data. And a lot of schools have taken me up on that. So, but I'm still looking for schools. So I would either open this up for questions, or those of you who need a break before we go on to classes today, you know, are welcome to get up and take a stretch break. Whatever you wish.
I just have a thought. What can you use the top text as part of a documentation? I know that in my daughter's in first grade, and they gave a practice top test at the end of the year. She had straight A's, all you whatever you call them here. But she didn't the assistant heard that question. She had never heard the question put that way because the interpreter had changed it.
Right, and I
And
think,
it wasn't the interpreter was bad. It wasn't, no one did anything wrong. I'm not criticizing. But I'm wondering if you could use top test data with, if there would be a way to correlate that.
well, I probably couldn't, but I think what's happening in your school is exactly what should happen. I mean, people need to realize that kids need to see the kinds of questions and be able to see that through the air before they're expected to understand it on a test. And to be able to use that data in that way is a very good thing.
See, I asked her to practice copies, and now this summer, as we've read, I signed her. What is this story mostly about? And I used all of the questions, forms that they would use on their test, so the next year was a little more fair for her.
And that's absolutely excellent. And I can tell you maybe even 15 years ago, I remember visiting a school in Omaha where the kids use C2, and it's a real good program. And they actually had a period of the day where they practiced taking tests. They practiced the language, they talked about test strategy, they talked about the way it might be worded. I see absolutely nothing wrong with that.
You couldn't do that as a, I mean, I think that would be an interesting research to see children who